The autumn rain tapped gently against the windows of the small art studio in Manchester, where Catherine Morrison sat perfectly still. Her silver hair caught the soft light filtering through the clouds, creating a halo effect that made the young artist pause with his brush mid-stroke. At 78 years old, Catherine had lived through more than most people could imagine, yet her eyes held a sparkle that belonged to someone half her age. James Fletcher, the 25-year-old portrait artist, had been commissioned by the local community center to paint portraits of elderly residents who had contributed significantly to the neighborhood. Catherine was his fifth subject, but something about her was different from the others. While previous sitters had shared stories of their achievements and families, Catherine simply sat there with a mysterious smile, as if she knew something the rest of the world had yet to discover. The studio smelled of oil paint and turpentine, a combination that Catherine found oddly comforting. She watched James work, noting how his brow furrowed in concentration as he mixed colors on his palette. The young man had talent. She could see that clearly. His previous portraits lined the walls of the studio, each one capturing not just the physical appearance of the subject but something deeper, something essential about who they were. Catherine had agreed to sit for the portrait only after much persuasion from her neighbor, Mrs. Pembridge, who ran the community center. She had never been one for attention or recognition, preferring to work quietly behind the scenes. For decades, she had been the invisible force that kept many local families afloat during hard times, though few knew the extent of her contributions. James dipped his brush into a mixture of burnt sienna and titanium white, trying to capture the exact shade of Catherine's weathered hands. They were hands that told stories, slightly gnarled from arthritis, with age spots dotting the surface like constellations. Yet they rested in her lap with an elegance that spoke of inner strength. He noticed a faint scar running along her left thumb and wondered about its origin. The rain intensified outside, creating rivulets on the window panes that distorted the view of the street beyond. Catherine's mind drifted to another rainy day, nearly 60 years ago, when she had first arrived in Manchester with nothing but a suitcase and a determination to start fresh. She had fled an abusive marriage in Scotland, leaving behind everything she knew for the promise of anonymity in a big city. Those early days had been hard. She had slept in church doorways and survived on the kindness of strangers until she found work in a textile factory. The work was grueling, the hours long, but Catherine never complained. She saved every penny she could, living on bread and tea, until she had enough to rent a small room above a bakery on Elm Street. James noticed the faraway look in Catherine's eyes and cleared his throat gently. "Would you like to take a break, Mrs. Morrison? You've been sitting for quite a while." Catherine blinked, returning to the present. "No, dear. I'm quite comfortable. You just continue with your work." The artist nodded and returned to his canvas. He was working on the background now, trying to decide what would best complement Catherine's presence. Some of his previous portraits featured elaborate settings, libraries, gardens, living rooms filled with family photographs. But for Catherine, he felt compelled to keep it simple. There was something about her that didn't need embellishment. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine found herself studying James as intently as he was studying her. He reminded her of someone, though she couldn't quite place who. Perhaps it was the way he held his brush, with a delicate precision that spoke of years of practice. Or maybe it was the kindness in his eyes when he looked up from his work to check on her comfort. She had never had children of her own. The abuse from her first marriage had left her unable to conceive, a fact she had hidden from everyone, including her second husband, dear William. He had passed away 15 years ago, leaving her alone but not lonely. The neighborhood had become her family, and she had poured all her maternal instincts into caring for others. James mixed a new color, a soft pink for the flush in Catherine's cheeks. Despite her age, there was a vitality about her that he wanted to capture. He had learned from their brief conversations that she still volunteered at the food bank 3 times a week and taught knitting classes at the community center. But he sensed there was more to her story, layers upon layers of experiences that she kept carefully hidden. The light was beginning to fade, and James knew they would need to stop soon. Portrait painting required good natural light, and the gray Manchester afternoon was giving way to evening. He set down his brush and stretched his cramped fingers, I think that's enough for today, Mrs. Morrison. You've been wonderfully patient. Catherine rose from her chair slowly, her joints protesting after sitting still for so long. She walked over to look at the canvas, and James held his breath. Artists were always nervous about their subjects' first reactions to works in progress. What she saw made her pause. The portrait was far from finished. But already James had captured something essential. The eyes that looked back at her from the canvas held secrets, yes, but also warmth and wisdom. It was like looking at herself through someone else's eyes, seeing qualities she had never recognized in the mirror. It's remarkable, she said softly. You have a gift, young man. James felt a flush of pride. Thank you. I'll need you to come back a few more times to finish it properly. Would next Tuesday work for you? And Catherine nodded, pulling on her worn but carefully maintained coat. Tuesday would be fine. Same time? Perfect. Let me walk you out. These stairs can be tricky in the dim light. As they descended the narrow staircase, Catherine gripped the banister tightly. Her body might be aging, but her spirit remained indomitable. She had survived things that would have broken many people, and she was still here, still contributing, still mattering. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the streetlights. The air smelled fresh and clean, with that particular scent that comes after rain in the city. Catherine breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the cool air. Do you have far to go? James asked, concerned about her walking alone in the gathering darkness. Just a few blocks. I've walked these streets for 60 years, dear. They're like old friends to me now. James watched her go, a small figure in a navy coat, moving with careful but determined steps. There was something about Catherine Morrison that intrigued him beyond the requirements of his commission. He had painted many portraits, but he had a feeling this one would be different. Back in her small flat, Catherine made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. The portrait session had stirred up memories she usually kept locked away. She thought about all the lives she had touched over the years, most of them never knowing the full extent of her involvement. There was young Tommy Sullivan, who she had secretly paid for to attend university when his father lost his job. He was a doctor now, with a practice in London. He still sent her Christmas cards, never knowing she was the anonymous benefactor who had changed his life. And the Patel family, who had arrived from India with nothing. Catherine had furnished their entire flat from her own savings, arranging for everything to be delivered while they were out, leaving only a note that said, "Welcome to the neighborhood." They had tried for years to discover their secret angel, but Catherine had covered her tracks well. Then there was the matter of the women's shelter. For 20 years, she had been sending monthly donations, always in cash, always anonymous. The shelter had helped dozens of women escape situations like the one she had fled from all those years ago. It was her way of turning her pain into purpose. Catherine sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. She had never sought recognition for any of it. The joy was in the giving, in knowing that she had made a difference. But now, sitting for this portrait, she wondered if perhaps it was time for her story to be known, not for glory or praise, but so that others might be inspired to look beyond themselves and see where they could help. The young artist, James, had kind eyes. She had seen how he looked at his other portraits, with genuine affection for his subjects. Perhaps through his art, some small part of her legacy could live on. Not the details, necessarily, but the spirit of it. The idea that one person, no matter how ordinary, could change the world around them through small acts of kindness. As she prepared for bed that night, Catherine looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. The face that stared back was lined and weathered, marked by years of living. But she saw strength there too, and purpose. Tomorrow she would go to the food bank as usual, would smile and chat with the regulars, would pack boxes with the same care she had been showing for 20 years. But Tuesday would come, and she would return to that small studio, would sit again under James's thoughtful gaze, and slowly, stroke by stroke, he would create something that would outlast them both. A portrait that would hang in the community center, where people would pause and wonder about the woman with the secret smile and knowing eyes. Catherine turned off the light and made her way to bed. Outside, Manchester hummed with its nighttime rhythms. Sirens in the distance, the occasional car passing by, the sound of footsteps on wet pavement. It was a symphony she had grown to love, the soundtrack of a life lived fully if quietly. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about her mother, long gone now, who used to say, "Catherine, my girl, it's not what you take from this world that matters, it's what you leave behind." At the time, young and frightened, and running from a broken marriage, she hadn't understood those words. Now, all these years later, she knew exactly what they meant. The portrait would be her testament, though James didn't know it yet. In trying to capture her likeness, he would capture something far more important. The essence of a life lived, in service to others, the quiet heroism of someone who chose to transform personal pain into communal healing. The rain began again, a gentle patter against her bedroom window. Catherine smiled in the darkness. Let it rain, she thought. Tomorrow the sun would come out, and there would be work to do. There was always work to do when you had chosen to be a light in the darkness. A helper in a world that needed all the help it could get. She didn't know that her portrait would indeed leave everyone speechless. But not just because of James's artistic skill. It would be the story behind it, the revelation of who Catherine Morrison really was, that would move people to tears and inspire a new generation of quiet heroes. But that was still to come. For now, she slept, peaceful in the knowledge that she had lived a life worth painting. Tuesday arrived with unexpected sunshine, a rare treat for Manchester in late October. Catherine woke earlier than usual, a strange flutter of anticipation in her chest. She dressed carefully, choosing a deep burgundy cardigan that William had given her for their last anniversary together. It brought out the warmth in her complexion, he had said, and even now she could hear his voice when she wore it. At the food bank that morning, she noticed her fellow volunteers watching her with curious expressions. Mary Chen, who had worked alongside her for the past decade, finally spoke up as they sorted canned goods. You seem different today, Catherine. There's something, I don't know, lighter about you. Catherine smiled, placing tins of soup into neat rows. Perhaps it's the sunshine. It does lift the spirits, doesn't it? But Mary wasn't satisfied with that answer. She had known Catherine long enough to recognize when her friend was keeping secrets. Not malicious ones. Catherine wasn't capable of malice, but the kind of secrets that protected others from worry or burden. The morning passed quickly, and soon Catherine was making her way to James's studio. The streets were busier than they had been the previous week, with people taking advantage of the good weather. She passed the corner shop where Mr. Ahmed always saved the day-old bread for families who couldn't afford fresh, giving him a wave through the window. He rushed out to press a small paper bag into her hands. Fresh samosas, Mrs. Morrison. My wife made them this morning. Oh, I couldn't possibly. Please. You helped my daughter with her university applications last month. It's the least we can do. Catherine accepted gracefully, knowing that refusing would hurt his pride. This was how the neighborhood worked. A complex web of kindnesses, given and received, that held the community together like invisible thread. When she arrived at the studio, James was already preparing his paints. The canvas stood on its easel, covered with a white cloth. He looked up as she entered, and she was struck again by how young he seemed, how much life lay ahead of him. Mrs. Morrison. Perfect timing. The light is wonderful today. Catherine took her position in the chair, arranging herself in the same pose as before, but James shook his head. Actually, I was wondering if we could try something different today. Would you mind sitting by the window instead? The natural light would be perfect for what I have in mind. She moved to the window seat, and James repositioned his easel. From this new angle, the light caught her face differently, illuminating the fine lines around her eyes and mouth, what William had called her laugh lines, evidence of a life that had found joy despite hardship. Tell me about your husband, James said as he began to work. If you don't mind, that is. Sometimes it helps to talk while sitting. Catherine's expression softened. William was extraordinary. Not in any flashy way, mind you. He was a bus driver, worked the same route for 30 years, but he saw people, really saw them, knew every regular passenger by name, remembered their stories. James's brush moved steadily as she spoke, capturing the way her face transformed when she talked about love. We met at a dance hall in 1965. I was 32, already considered a spinster by most standards. I'd been on my own for 10 years by then, had built a life I was content with. I wasn't looking for romance. She paused, lost in the memory. But William was persistent in the gentlest way. He'd appear at the places I volunteered, always with some excuse, needed help organizing a charity drive for the bus drivers' union, wanted advice on supporting a colleague whose wife was ill. It took me 6 months to realize he was courting me. James smiled, adding highlights to her silver hair. He sounds wonderful. He was. When I finally told him about my past, about my first marriage and why I'd run away, I expected him to withdraw. Men of his generation didn't often understand such things, but he just held my hands and said, "Well, Catherine, that man was a fool. His loss is my gain." The artist noticed tears gathering in Catherine's eyes but continuing to work, allowing her the dignity of her emotions without comment. We had 38 years together, no children, but William never made me feel like I was lacking. He said I was mother to half the neighborhood anyway, and he was right. Every Christmas, our small flat would be full of people who had nowhere else to go. William would play his accordion, terrible player, but enthusiastic, and I'd cook enough food to feed an army. Outside the window, a mother walked by pushing a pram, and Catherine watched them with a wistful smile. After he died, I thought about leaving Manchester, starting fresh somewhere sunny, perhaps by the sea. But then I realized, this is my home. These streets, these people, they're my family. William's still here in every life we touch together. James stepped back to examine his work, then moved forward again to adjust something in the eyes. He was beginning to understand what made Catherine so special. It wasn't any single act of kindness or sacrifice, but the accumulation of thousands of small choices to help, to care, to stay, when leaving, would have been easier. "Can I ask you something personal?" James ventured. "At my age, dear, everything is personal. Ask away. Do you ever regret not having children of your own?" Catherine considered the question carefully. Regret is a strong word. I grieved for it, certainly, especially in the early years. But look at Tommy Sullivan. Dr. Sullivan now. I taught him to read when his parents were too busy working 3 jobs to make ends meet. And little Sarah Williams, who's not so little anymore, about to graduate from law school. I helped her with homework every evening for years, while her mother was in hospital. She shifted slightly, and James noted the new angle of light across her face. I may not have had children in the traditional sense, but I've been blessed to be part of raising dozens, and unlike regular parents, I got to give them back at the end of the day. They both laughed at this, and James realized this was what he needed to capture. Not just Catherine's kindness or wisdom, but her humor, her ability to find lightness even in discussion of what must have been profound loss. As the afternoon progressed, James found himself sharing his own story. How he'd grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes, never quite fitting in. How art had saved him, giving him a way to process emotions he couldn't put into words. How this commission to paint community heroes was his way of giving back. Catherine listened with the same attention she'd given to countless others over the years. When he finished, she said simply, "Art chose you, James. And you chose to honor that gift by using it to celebrate others. That's a rare thing." The sun was beginning to slant through the window when they heard footsteps on the stairs. James frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. The door opened, and a well-dressed man in his 50s entered, looking somewhat uncertain. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm looking for Mrs. Catherine Morrison." Catherine turned, and her eyes widened in recognition. "Tommy? Tommy Sullivan?" The man's face broke into a smile. "I can't believe it's really you. Mrs. Pembridge at the community center told me you were here. I hope you don't mind." I had to come. James watched, fascinated, as Catherine rose to embrace the visitor. This must be the Dr. Sullivan she'd mentioned, the boy she'd secretly helped through university. What are you doing in Manchester? Catherine asked, her face glowing with pleasure. Medical conference at the university. But I've been trying to find you for years. You moved from your old flat, and no one seemed to know where you'd gone. Tommy turned to James, extending his hand. I'm sorry for barging in. I'm Dr. Thomas Sullivan. Mrs. Morrison here. Well, she saved my life, though she'd never admit it. Catherine waved dismissively. Nonsense. You saved your own life through hard work and determination. But Tommy shook his head firmly. No, Mrs. Morrison. I need to tell you something. I know it was you. The anonymous scholarship that got me through medical school. I know it was you. Catherine's face went still, and James held his breath. This was clearly a secret she'd kept for decades. I don't know what you mean, she said quietly, but Tommy was already pulling out a worn envelope from his jacket. My mother kept everything from those years. After she died last year, I was going through her papers and found this. He showed them a receipt from the university, paid in full, with a bank stamp that matched deposits Catherine had made over the years. I traced it back. It took months, but I traced it back to you. Catherine sank back into the window seat, her composure finally cracking. You weren't supposed to know. Why? Tommy's voice was thick with emotion. Why did you do it? And why hide it? She looked up at him, this successful doctor who had once been a scared boy with too much responsibility on his young shoulders. Because you deserved a chance, and I had the means to provide it. William and I had saved that money for travels we never took. What better use for it than to send a brilliant young mind into the world to heal others? Tommy knelt beside her chair, taking her weathered hands in his. Do you have any idea how many lives you've changed? Not just mine. All the patients I've helped, all the doctors I've trained. It all traces back to you. James continued painting, trying to capture this moment, the way Catherine's face reflected both embarrassment at being discovered and joy at seeing what her secret gift had accomplished. This was the portrait now, not just a woman sitting for a painting, but a life revealed in all its quiet magnificence. There are others, Tommy said softly. I've been investigating. The Patel family, the women's shelter, the youth center that mysteriously received new sports equipment every year. It was all you, wasn't it? Catherine's silence was answer enough. Why hide it? James asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Most people want recognition for their good deeds. Catherine looked at him with those wise eyes. Because true charity isn't about the giver. It's about the receiver. The moment you put your name on it, it becomes about you. I wanted it to be about them. About what they could become, without the burden of gratitude. But Tommy wasn't satisfied with this answer. We had a right to know. To thank you. Did you? Catherine challenged gently. Tell me, Dr. Sullivan, would you have worked as hard if you'd known the scholarship came from your elderly neighbor instead of some prestigious foundation? Would you have felt the same pride in your achievements? Or would there always have been a voice saying you owed it all to someone else? Tommy fell silent, recognizing the truth in her words. James continued painting, understanding now why Catherine's portrait would be unlike any other. He wasn't just painting a kind old woman. He was painting someone who had understood that the greatest gift you could give another person was the chance to believe in themselves. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the studio floor. Tommy stayed for another hour, sharing stories of his career, his family, the free clinic he ran in London's East End. Catherine listened with the satisfaction of a gardener seeing seeds she'd planted bloom into full flower. When he finally left, promising to visit again soon, Catherine seemed smaller somehow, as if sharing her secret had diminished her in some way. James set down his brushes and came to sit beside her. You know what I think? He said. I think you're afraid. She looked at him sharply. Afraid? At my age, there's very little left to fear. I think you're afraid that if people know who you really are, what you've really done, they'll expect you to be some kind of saint. And you're just Catherine, who likes her tea with 2 sugars and watches detective shows on Sunday nights. A surprised laugh escaped her. How did you know about the detective shows? Lucky guess. But I'm right, aren't I? You've spent so long being everyone's secret angel that you've forgotten it's okay to be human too. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, then smiled. You're quite perceptive for someone so young. Foster care will do that to you. You learn to read people quickly. James returned to his easel. I need to tell you something. This portrait, it's going to be the centerpiece of the exhibition. And after what I witnessed today, I think people need to know your story. James, no, that's not what I agreed to. Not the details, he assured her. Not the names or the amounts or the secrets that aren't mine to tell. But the spirit of it. The truth that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, not through grand gestures, but through consistency, through showing up, through choosing love over and over again. Catherine considered this. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the Manchester sky in shades of pink and gold. The city she'd called home for 60 years spread out before them, full of lives she'd touched, stories she'd helped write. May I see the painting? She asked. James hesitated. He never showed works in progress. But something in Catherine's voice made him nod. He carefully turned the easel so she could see. Catherine gasped softly. The woman in the portrait was her, undoubtedly, but transformed somehow. James had captured not just her physical appearance but something ineffable. The accumulated weight of thousands of kindnesses, the strength that comes from choosing to help rather than harm, the beauty of a life lived for others. Oh, James, she whispered, it's not finished yet. I still need to work on the hands, and the background needs more depth. But the essential you, I think I've found her. Catherine stood slowly, her joints protesting. I think that's enough for today. Same time next week? Actually, I was hoping we could meet a few more times this week. I want to finish while everything I learned today is fresh in my mind. She agreed, gathering her things. As she prepared to leave, she turned back to him. James, I want you to know something. What you're doing with these portraits, celebrating ordinary people, it matters. Long after we're all gone, these paintings will remain, telling people that heroism doesn't always wear a cape or make headlines. Sometimes it wears a cardigan and makes soup for the hungry. After she left, James stood before the portrait for a long time. He'd painted many people, but never someone like Catherine. Tomorrow, he would work on the hands, those hands that had comforted the grieving, prepared countless meals for the hungry, written checks that changed lives. He would paint them with all the reverence they deserved. But tonight, he simply stood and looked. Understanding for the first time what his art teacher had meant when she said that portrait painting was about capturing souls, not faces. Catherine Morrison's soul, he realized, was too large for any canvas. The best he could do was suggest its vastness, like painting the ocean by showing a single wave. He covered the painting carefully and turned off the lights. Tomorrow would bring another session, another layer of paint and understanding. But already he knew this portrait would be different. It would make people stop and look, really look, at the quiet heroes among them. As he locked the studio door, he thought about Catherine walking home through the familiar streets, probably stopping to check on a neighbor or slip some money to a homeless veteran she'd been helping for years. She would never see herself as he saw her, as Tommy Sullivan saw her, as the countless lives she'd touched saw her. But that was Catherine's gift and her burden. To give so freely that she couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what she'd given. The portrait would be his gift back to her, a mirror that showed not just who she was but who she had helped others become. The streets of Manchester were quiet as he made his way home. But James felt as if he could hear the echo of all the stories Catherine had set in motion. Children grown into doctors and teachers, families kept together through secret support, women given second chances at life. It was a symphony of human kindness, and Catherine was its composer, working always behind the scenes, never taking a bow. 3 more sessions, he decided. 3 more sessions to capture what might be uncapturable. The essence of a woman who had turned personal pain into public good, who had discovered that the antidote to suffering was not revenge or bitterness but radical, persistent, anonymous love. The portrait would be finished soon, and when it was unveiled at the community center, when people saw Catherine as she truly was, James had a feeling it would indeed leave everyone speechless, not because of his skill as an artist, but because of the story it would tell. The story of how one ordinary woman had quietly changed the world, one act of kindness at a time. The community center buzzed with anticipation on the evening of the portrait unveiling. November had arrived with its characteristic chill. But inside the hall, warmth radiated from both the heating system and the gathered crowd. People from all corners of Manchester's diverse neighborhoods had come together, drawn by word of mouth about something special happening tonight. Catherine stood in the bathroom, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck for the third time. Her neighbor, Mrs. Pembridge, had insisted on taking her shopping for a new outfit for the occasion. She'd protested, of course, but eventually succumbed to the younger woman's enthusiasm. Now, looking at herself in the mirror wearing an elegant navy dress, she hardly recognized herself. "Catherine, dear, are you all right in there?" Mrs. Pembridge's voice carried through the door. "Just a moment," Catherine called back, taking one last deep breath. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. For 60 years, she'd operated in the shadows, content to let others shine. But tonight, James had insisted, was her night. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind. After Tommy Sullivan's visit, word had somehow spread through the neighborhood grapevine. Not the specifics. Catherine had been grateful that Tommy had kept those private, but the general sense that their quiet neighbor was more than she seemed. People had begun looking at her differently, with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. James had finished the portrait 3 days ago, declaring it complete with a satisfied sigh. He'd refused to let her see the final version, insisting the unveiling should be her first viewing. She'd protested, but his eyes had held such excitement that she'd reluctantly agreed. When she finally emerged from the bathroom, Mrs. Pembridge clasped her hands together. "Oh, Catherine, you look wonderful, like royalty." "Nonsense," Catherine replied, but she was smiling. "Shall we go?" I'd rather not be late to my own embarrassment. The main hall was fuller than she'd ever seen it. Familiar faces turned as she entered. Mr. Ahmed from the corner shop with his entire family, the volunteers from the food bank, neighbors she'd known for decades, but there were also strangers. People she didn't recognize, all here for the portrait unveiling. "Catherine!" a familiar voice called out, and she turned to see Sarah Williams pushing through the crowd. The young woman she'd helped with homework was indeed not so little anymore, confident and poised in her business suit. "Sarah, dear, I didn't know you were coming. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I took the train from London as soon as I heard." Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I never got to properly thank you for everything. The hours you spent with me, making sure I didn't fall behind when Mum was sick. You changed my life." Before Catherine could deflect the praise as she usually did, another voice joined them. "Mrs. Morrison!" It was one of the Patel children. Not children anymore, she realized. Priya Patel was a nurse now. Her hospital ID badge still clipped to her coat. "I just finished my shift and rushed over. My parents are here somewhere. They've never stopped wondering who furnished our flat when we first arrived. Was it really you?" Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. This was exactly what she'd wanted to avoid. The weight of gratitude. The burden of being seen as special. But looking at Priya's earnest face, at Sarah standing tall and proud, she found she couldn't lie. "Your family needed help. I had the means to provide it. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Priya said firmly. "They wouldn't have. And they didn't. Only you did." James appeared at her elbow, looking handsome in a dark suit. "Mrs. Morrison, it's time. Are you ready?" Ready. She wanted to say no, to flee back to her small flat where she could be just Catherine, maker of tea and watcher of detective shows. But the crowd was already moving toward the far wall, where a covered easel stood waiting. The community center director, Mr. Hartwell called for silence. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to unveil the latest in our series of portraits celebrating local heroes. When we commissioned young James Fletcher to paint members of our community who had made a difference, we expected lovely paintings of familiar faces. What we didn't expect was to discover just how extraordinary some of our neighbors truly are. Catherine felt James's hand on her elbow, steady and reassuring. He whispered, "Remember, this isn't just about you. It's about showing everyone here what's possible when we choose kindness." Mr. Hartwell continued, "Catherine Morrison has lived in this neighborhood for 60 years. Many of you know her from the food bank, the knitting circle, or simply as the lady who always has a kind word and a listening ear. What you might not know is the depth of her impact on this community." A murmur ran through the crowd. Catherine noticed Tommy Sullivan standing near the back, having driven up from London again. He caught her eye and smiled encouragingly. "I won't share specifics," Mr. Hartwell said, "because Mrs. Morrison has always preferred her good works to remain anonymous. But I will say this. There are doctors, lawyers, business owners, and teachers standing in this room tonight who owe their success to her quiet intervention. There are families who stayed together because of her support, women who found safety because of her contributions, children who had Christmas presents because she made sure of it." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. This was too much, surely. She was just one person who had tried to help where she could. "But perhaps," Mr. Hartwell continued, "it's best to let the portrait speak for itself. James?" James stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the cloth covering the painting. "Before I unveil this, I want to say something. I've painted many portraits, but this one changed me. Catherine Morrison showed me that heroism isn't about grand gestures or recognition. It's about showing up, day after day, year after year, and choosing to make things a little better. She taught me that we all have the power to change lives. We just have to decide to use it." He pulled away the cloth in one smooth motion, and a collective gasp rose from the crowd. The portrait was magnificent. James had captured Catherine seated by the window, natural light illuminating her face in a way that seemed almost ethereal. But it was the details that made people lean in, that brought tears to eyes throughout the room. In the background, barely visible unless you looked closely, were shadows of all the lives she'd touched. A young man in a graduation cap, a family gathered around a dinner table, women walking freely from a shelter door. They were painted so subtly they might have been tricks of the light, but they were there. Testimonies to a life lived in service. Her hands, painted with exquisite care, rested in her lap but seemed to glow with an inner light, suggesting all they had given. And her eyes, James had somehow captured decades of compassion, wisdom, and quiet strength in those painted eyes, but it was her expression that made people stop and stare. It wasn't the formal smile of most portraits. Instead, James had painted her with a look of gentle attention, as if she were listening to someone's troubles, ready to help. It was the expression hundreds of people had seen over the years when they'd needed someone to care. Catherine stood frozen, unable to speak. The portrait was her, undoubtedly. But it was also more than her. It was every person who had ever chosen kindness over indifference, every small act of love that had rippled out into the world. The silence stretched until someone began to clap. It was Tommy Sullivan, his surgeon's hands creating a steady rhythm. Others joined in: Sarah Williams, the Patel family, Mr. Ahmed, the food bank volunteers. Soon the entire hall was applauding, not just for the portrait but for the woman it represented. "Speech!" someone called out, and others took up the cry. "Speech! Speech!" Catherine shook her head, but James gently guided her to the front. The applause died down as she stood there, small and suddenly fragile-looking, before her community. She began, then stopped, overwhelmed. She tried again. "I don't make speeches. I'm not a speaker. I'm just Catherine." "Exactly," called out a voice from the crowd. It was Mrs. Chen from the food bank. "You're just Catherine, who never missed a shift in 20 years. You're just Catherine, who knows every regular by name and saves the best produce for families with children. You're just Catherine, added Mr. Ahmed, who taught my daughter English when we first arrived, sitting with her every evening after the shop closed. You're just Catherine, said an unfamiliar woman, stepping forward, who sent anonymous gifts to the women's shelter for 20 years. I know because I lived there once, and those gifts included a note that said simply, "You are not alone." That note saved my life. One by one, people began sharing their stories, not seeking details or demanding explanations, but simply acknowledging what Catherine had meant to them. The young mother she'd babysat for during night classes, the elderly man she'd visited weekly after his wife died, the teenager she'd hired to help with odd jobs that didn't really need doing, just to give him purpose and pocket money. Catherine wept openly now, overwhelmed by the outpouring. She had never imagined that her small acts had been noticed, remembered, treasured. She had simply done what seemed right at the time, what her heart had called her to do. When the stories finally ended, she found her voice. "My first husband used to tell me I was worthless," she said quietly. And the room fell silent. He said I would never amount to anything, that no one would ever care if I lived or died. For a long time, I believed him. She looked around the room at all the faces, all the lives interconnected by threads of kindness. But then I came here, to Manchester, to this neighborhood. And I learned that he was wrong. Not because I was special, but because I discovered that every person has the power to matter, to make a difference. All we have to do is choose to see each other, to help each other, to believe that small acts of love can change the world. Her voice grew stronger. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who learned that the best revenge against cruelty is kindness, that the answer to being torn down is to build others up. Everything I gave, I received back tenfold. You say I changed your lives, but the truth is, you saved mine. Each of you, by letting me be part of your stories, gave me purpose and meaning. She turned to look at the portrait again. James has painted me as far more than I am. But perhaps that's what art does. It shows us not just who we are, but who we can aspire to be. If this portrait inspires even one person to look around and see where they can help, then it's worth 1,000 times more than any recognition you could give me. The room was silent for a moment, then erupted in applause again. But Catherine was already moving through the crowd, stopping to embrace people, to check on how they were doing, to be simply herself, the neighbor who cared. James watched her work the room, marveling at how she could make each person feel like the most important one there. Mr. Hartwell appeared beside him. It's a masterpiece, James, truly. We'll have to increase security. I have a feeling people will come from all over to see this. James nodded, but he was thinking about something else. You know what's remarkable? She still doesn't see herself the way we see her. Even now, with all these stories, all this evidence, she thinks she's ordinary. Maybe that's what makes her extraordinary, Mr. Hartwell suggested. The truly good ones never think they're doing anything special. As the evening progressed, James noticed Catherine beginning to flag. The emotion of the evening, the weight of being seen after so many years of invisibility, was taking its toll. He made his way to her side. Would you like me to walk you home, Mrs. Morrison? She looked up at him gratefully. That would be kind, dear. But let's go out the side door. I've had quite enough of grand exits for one lifetime. They slipped out quietly into the cold November night. The streets were peaceful, with only the distant sound of traffic and the occasional person hurrying home. Catherine pulled her coat tighter and breathed deeply. Are you angry with me? James asked. For making such a fuss? Catherine considered the question as they walked. No, dear. Not angry. It's just difficult to have your life laid bare like that. I spent so many years being careful, keeping secrets, making sure the help never had my fingerprints on it. And now everyone knows that Catherine Morrison is a force of good in the world? She laughed, a short, surprised sound. A force of good. My mother would have gotten such a kick out of that. She always said I was too soft-hearted for my own good. They reached her building, and Catherine paused at the entrance. James, I need you to know something. That portrait, it's not just me you painted. It's all of us. Everyone who chooses to help instead of harm. You've given people a mirror to see their own potential for goodness. I painted what I saw, James said simply. Then you saw with the eyes of love, Catherine replied. And that's the greatest gift an artist can have. She climbed the stairs slowly, her age showing more than usual. At her door, she turned back to him. Thank you, James. For everything. For showing me that it's all right to be seen. That there's no shame in having lived a life of love. After she closed the door, James stood in the hallway for a moment. Through the thin walls, he could hear her moving about, probably making tea, returning to the comfortable rhythms of her daily life. Tomorrow she would be back at the food bank, back to her knitting circle, back to the 1,000 small kindnesses that made up her days. But something had changed tonight. The portrait would hang in the community center, a permanent reminder that heroes walked among them. People would point it out to their children, tell the story of the woman who gave secretly and loved widely, and perhaps some of them would be inspired to follow her example, to look for opportunities to help, to choose kindness over indifference. As James walked home through the quiet streets, he thought about his next commission. How could he possibly paint anyone else after Catherine? How could any other story compare to hers? Then he smiled, remembering something Catherine had said weeks ago. Everyone has a story worth telling, James. You just have to look with the right eyes. He would paint the next portrait, and the next. Each one revealing the hidden depths of ordinary people. But Catherine's would always be special. The painting that had taught him that true art wasn't just about capturing appearance, but about revealing the soul. Back in her flat, Catherine sat in her favorite chair, sipping her tea and looking out at the city lights. On the table beside her lay the evening's program, with a photo of the portrait on the cover. She picked it up, studying James's work in the quiet of her home. It was a good likeness, she decided. But more than that, it was a good story. Not just her story, but the story of a community that had taken in a frightened woman and given her purpose. The story of how small acts could ripple outward, creating waves of change. The story of choosing love, again and again, until it became as natural as breathing. She thought of William, how proud he would have been tonight. You did it, Cat, she could almost hear him say. You took all that pain and turned it into something beautiful. Tomorrow there would be more to do. The food bank had received a large donation and needed extra hands for sorting. Mrs. Chen's daughter was struggling with her university applications and had asked for help. The shelter was organizing its Christmas drive and needed volunteers. But tonight, Catherine allowed herself this moment of satisfaction. Not pride. Exactly. But a deep contentment in knowing that her life had mattered. That her choices had made a difference. Outside, Manchester slept, unaware that in a small flat above a bakery, a hero was finishing her tea and preparing for bed. Not a hero in cape or armor, but a hero nonetheless. One who had discovered that the greatest superpower was the ability to see need and meet it, to see pain and ease it, to see potential and nurture it. The portrait would hang in the community center for generations, long after Catherine Morrison had passed on. People would pause before it, drawn by something in those painted eyes, something that seemed to ask, what will you do with your one precious life? How will you choose to matter? And perhaps, if James had captured even a fraction of Catherine's spirit, they would leave with an answer forming in their hearts. They would look around their own neighborhoods, their own communities, and see not problems but opportunities. They would understand that heroism wasn't about grand gestures but about consistency, about showing up, about choosing love, even when it would be easier to look away. Catherine turned off the lights and made her way to bed. Tomorrow would be another day of small kindnesses, of quiet service. The spotlight would fade, and she would return to her preferred shadows. But something had been set in motion tonight. A ripple of inspiration that would spread in ways she couldn't imagine. In the community center, the portrait remained illuminated by a single light, keeping watch over the empty hall. In the morning, people would come to see it, to hear the story of Catherine Morrison, and some of them, touched by the quiet radiance James had captured, would go home and look for their own opportunities to serve. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. One person choosing kindness, inspiring another, creating a chain of compassion that could transform communities, cities, the world, and at the heart of it, a portrait of an ordinary woman who had lived an extraordinary life, not through fame or fortune, but through the revolutionary act of caring. The night settled over Manchester, peaceful and full of promise. And in a small flat above a bakery, Catherine Morrison slept soundly, her life's work complete but far from over, her legacy not in monuments or wealth but in the countless lives she'd touched, and the endless ripples of kindness that would flow from this night forward.